Okay, we're on the hour, so I think we can get started. I'll be doing a brief intro, and we do have many more on the participants list that I'm sure will be joining shortly. My name's Carlos Mendez, and I'm a director at the EPRC. Welcome to one of our EPRC webinars. Today we welcome Dr. Stefanie Vedder from the Federal Institute for Research on Building, Urban Affairs and Spatial Development, who'll be speaking on the topic of worries and satisfaction using subjective indicators to map regional inequalities with a focus on mining areas. The presentation will last around 30 minutes or so there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. At that stage, if you'd like to make an intervention, please just use the raise the hand function or post a question in the chat, and we'll address these in the question and answer session. Just to let you know, the webinar is being recorded so that you and colleagues can have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage. And just so that you know, the video will be posted on our YouTube channel and shared by email. Feel free to share your thoughts on social media. Okay, so let me present our speaker today. Stefanie Vedder is a senior researcher at the Federal Institute for Research on Building, Urban Affairs and Spatial Development, the BBSR in Cottbus. She studied politics and law at the University of Münster, political science at Leibniz University at Hanover, and IR, international relations in Warsaw. Stefanie completed her PhD at the University of Kassel with experimental work on soft skills and personnel recruitment in the civil service. Her research interests are in legitimacy and acceptance of public administration and politics. And she's worked on various projects, including empirical studies on the politicization of bureaucracies and on norms and governance models in local administration. At the BBSR, Stefanie focuses on regional inequalities and the subjective perception of quality of life, with special attention to mining regions. I'll give the floor to you, Stefanie, if you're happy to share your slides.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for your introduction. And yes, let me quickly share my screen. Sorry, just give me a sec.
I'm not currently hearing Stefanie. Marina, are you able to hear? Yep, okay.
Yeah, I can hear Stefanie.
Okay, maybe I was just, I was kind of still in thought and just trying to get everything to work. So maybe that was my problem. Can you hear me fine now? Okay, see some nodding.
Yes, that's clear.
Perfect. Okay, and you see my full screen presentation right now, right?
Yes.
Great. Then thanks again for the introduction, and thanks for having me and for being willing to have me hold my presentation on this topic on worries satisfaction using subjective indicators to map regional inequalities, which is part of an ongoing project. And I'm going to mention the stages of the project and other related projects throughout the presentation. So if there are any questions on the related projects that I'm going to mention every now and again, feel free to ask, and I'm really happy to talk about them as well. Give me a short second. There we go. That's the things I would like to talk about today. First, I'm going to give you some context about structural transformation in lignite mining areas, because those areas are our focus here at the Institute in general. And they do have some very distinct specifics that I think I should mention to make the context of all our projects clear. And that brings me to aims and scopes of our research project, the one I'm going to talk about right now. And as I mentioned, some other projects that I'm happy to talk about as well, should there be any questions regarding those aspects. I'm going to spend some time on presenting our data sources, which is mainly the German socioeconomic panel. And I'm going to show you some selected results. I want to emphasize selected because there's some analysis still ongoing and some questions we'd like to look into further. I'm going to come to a short conclusion and show you some of our upcoming publications, which might be of interest to you and some of the sources we are using. Right. That brings me, as I mentioned, as I said, to the context, the transformation of German lignite mining areas. These lignite mining areas that you see on the slide right now are currently undergoing a transformation because of the final coal phase out that is set for 2038 in case of the two East German mining areas, the Lusatian mining area, Lusatia for short, and the Central German mining area, and which is set for 2030 in case of the West German mining area, the Rhenish mining area. So they have a kind of shortened time period till that moment when they are supposed to have completely transitioned to renewable energies and stopped the coal mining entirely. And please note, maybe that confuses some people who are usually working in this kind of subject, that I deliberately do not speak of mining districts, which would usually be the more common term, but I'm deliberately speaking of larger areas or regions. And the reason for that is that the boundaries of these regions here defined as lignite mining areas are the result of a political definition and do not solely encompass districts in which the landscape is really shaped by coal mining or in which coal mining is the sole significant economic sector. The mining areas are quite a bit bigger than that. And this definition in itself is pretty difficult. It's a difficult discussion, an ongoing discussion on its own. And in another project, we analyze, among other things, if and to what extent actors in these regions actually consider themselves as part of mining areas and whether they think that the way these boundaries were drawn, as I said, in this political negotiations are just or are helpful at all. That's a quite different discussion, which is difficult in itself. This phase out means a complete restructuring of local economies, and it is also likely to have a significant impact on local identity within these areas. And these two aspects, economy and identity, of course, influence each other, but are for analysis two very distinct things that we look at. And in addition, especially the East German lignite mining areas also face a form of shrinking with a large negative net migration and a quickly aging population, which is, of course, an additional challenge they have to deal with. And our context now more specifically is that there is a large governmental funding program of around 40 billion euros that is supposed to support these regions in coping with their challenges and especially with the coal phase out. This program mainly focuses on economic development and the upkeep and the development of infrastructure, but it uses a very broad understanding of these terms, economic development and infrastructure, and that leaves a really pretty big leeway for identifying the measures to reach these goals. For example, a part of economic development could also be providing childcare, which would make or should make the region attractive for families or for professionals who could potentially move to this region. And the three areas or regions themselves have each given themselves a general orientation in the form of their own mission statements, which take into consideration the regional specifics, such as their spatial and settlement structures, which are quite different. I'm going to come to that a bit later. And these statements do not only include the economic development or the attractiveness for economic development, but also a high quality of life for the people living in these areas and for people potentially moving to the regions. And as we know from extensive research and from other reports, quality of life is not really easy to operationalize and is even more difficult to measure in a way that makes the results valid and therefore informative for the evaluation of development programs. And that brings me to the aims and scope of our research, of the research projects that we do here. This specific project is supposed to be a supplementation for funding program evaluations, for the evaluations of this large funding government funding program that I just mentioned. These evaluations as well usually focus on economic aspects and on objective indicators such as labor market development. And what we do as a supplementation is we focus on subjective evaluation and individual level information. These evaluations are mainly administered by states, so it's not a federal project, but there are 3 different state projects, one for each area. And those evaluations, of course, are tailored to the regions, which makes perfect sense considering that each area decides on their own project. They get this federal support program, but they decide themselves what they do with that money, or almost completely independently. And our project specifically addresses differences and similarities between the mining areas because we do not focus on the efficacy of individual economic programs. So we asked the following questions: how do satisfaction with life in general and satisfaction with specific areas of life develop over time? Which issues are considered most pressing or concerning by local actors and by the population? I'm going to focus on the population for today. And what we do in addition is the comparison within and between mining areas, more specifically looking at which context factors significantly influence development, the development of satisfaction, as well as the development of concerns, and how does local history and identity factor into the acceptance and into individual evaluation of development. Within each of these areas, the different areas of satisfaction, we collect data at least at the county level. Some indicators are available at municipal level, so we can geo-reference our different results and try to come to conclusion not only just for the federal level, the state level, or the areas, the mining areas, but on a much smaller scale as well. And as a kind of another form of supplementation, we also conduct qualitative research, mainly using in-depth interviews to better understand the consequences of local identity and the individual understanding of structural transformation. And with that, let me come to our database, which, at least in this part of the project, is mainly the German Socioeconomic Panel, SEP for short. The SEP is a panel study that started in 1984 and is a wide-ranging representative longitudinal study of private households and of the larger population, and it's one of the largest running multidisciplinary household surveys worldwide, administered by the German Institute for Economic Research. And we are very lucky to have a cooperation with them so that we have direct access to the complete data sets. The sample in general for the whole of Germany contains about 30,000 people and 22,000 households each year, with several sub-data sets, which include refugees, youth, or parents. And the data and documentation are all available online. I put the link here on the slide just in case if you're interested in the data. They are all openly, or most of the data sets are open access and can be used for several different purposes. They're not all very intuitive, but in case you're interested, here you find the link to the documentation. Then there is a sub-data set or a supplementation, which we call sub-coal, which is an oversampling in those lignite mining regions that I showed you before on that slide from 2022 onwards, and which now contains a bit more than 2,000 households, almost 3,000 individuals, which are weighted according to register-based census data, which means that the conclusions we draw from this data are actually representative. And the number of cases allow for a geo-referencing and disaggregation to at least the county level, which I mentioned before. We are working on further disaggregation to get to the municipal level with at least some of the variables we can get from this panel data. That is part of another ongoing project on labor market development, because you can imagine that that's not easy to do because we still have to avoid or we have to preserve the anonymity of the people taking part in this survey data, but it's something that we're still working on. And with that in mind, with this database, starting with this base, I want to show you some selected results, starting with life satisfaction. These presented results are really only a selection because some of the analysis are still ongoing. What we see here is that we have large discrepancies in life satisfaction over the course of the 1990s, which was not very surprising if we look at the history and at the division between East and West Germany. So these large discrepancies are mainly based in historical context of the East and West German areas. in the East German mining areas, they experienced a major shock after German reunification, which included a complete restructuring of the economic system and of the labor market, which explains this large discrepancies right at the beginning of the 1990s. Then after a while, over time, we see a gradual conversion of life satisfaction. You see the three mining areas here in the colors yellow, red, and green. The yellow and the red one, Lusatia and the Central German mining regions are the East German mining areas. The Rhenish mining area is the mining area in West Germany, and they are all compared to the mean for the whole of Germany. As I said, we see a gradual conversion, but some other analyses show that this convergence slows down in recent years and that a complete convergence, even if we do not have any further external shocks or anything unforeseen, then this convergence is still pretty unlikely to happen for at least another few decades. So we're getting closer and closer to convergence, but it's we can doubt if we ever get to that point where we have a complete convergence between the East German and the West German mining areas. And as we know from other studies and reports, again, life satisfaction in general is very informative when it comes to larger trends, larger developments over time, but is not an sufficient indicator for evaluation of programs, of very specific programs. And in our cases, it is helpful to have a first look at developments, but it's not informative enough as to the potential effect of development of economic structures, labor market, and so on, which is why we look at specific areas of satisfaction as well. The SEP, the socioeconomic panel, which I introduced earlier, includes several items on satisfaction. And here I'm only going to show you a selection of that. Here we see the aspects that can mostly be influenced by development programs or are likely to be influenced by development programs and which align to the economic focus of the government program. I mentioned before that that's the main thing this funding program mentions. That's the attractiveness for economic development. And another reason for our selection of these aspects, jobs, personal income, household income, social welfare net, and dwelling, the way people are living, is the political discourse, political communication, public discourse, because economic development and especially the loss of jobs are significant topics of conversation, even though the mining industries only provide jobs for less than 1% of all employees in the regions. This is still the one topic that dominates discussion, which is why we focus on these aspects, these areas of satisfaction. We have not yet found a clear explanation for the generally lower satisfaction in the central German mining area as compared to Lusatia. Something that we expected is that the satisfaction in all these aspects is slightly lower in the East German areas than in the West German area, in the Rhenish mining area. But for these differences between the two East German mining areas, we have not found the absolutely sure explanation yet. We can think about multiple discrepancies theory, and then we could assume an effect of the more diverse settlement structure and living environment in the central German mining area. But at this point, that is just a guess that we are still working on. The fact that life satisfaction in general is distinctly higher than economy-related variables, at least in our interpretation, emphasizes the relevance of social networks, which we have yet to factor into our analysis. What you can see here is that the dots, which represent the different answers, the means from the survey data, are quite close to one another. So the differences between satisfaction between the areas well, we can see differences, but they are mostly marginal. This changes drastically when we do not look at satisfaction, but at worries or at concerns, which is what I'm going to show you next. We have at first glance a huge difference, especially between Lusatia and the other mining areas, and other here always means the whole rest of Germany. But even between within East Germany, we have these huge differences. We expected some differences, but never in this extent, never this large. We think that we expected that job security might raise bigger concerns. You see here that less than 10%, no matter which area we look at, are very concerned about their job security. That might have been, or we expected it to be higher, again, keeping in mind that job loss, job security is such a huge topic in political debate, but it basically mirrors the comparative insignificance of the mining industry in these areas. However, it does not mirror the relevance of job security as a topic when we just listen to discussions and to the political debate. For the individual variables, there are hardly any discrepancies between East and West, but this changes, as I said, drastically when looking at variables that relate to an overall development, like the development of the economy in general, and especially social cohesion, which means that when it comes to my own economic situation, it doesn't really make that much of a difference where I live. Yes, I do have some worries, or there are about 20% everywhere of people who are very concerned about their own economic situation and a bit more for provision for old age. But the differences there are not really that surprising or that large. What is surprising is this huge leap, this huge gap to all the variables that consider not my own situation, but a larger, well, societal development, the economy in general, and social cohesion in society. And especially many people in Lusatia worry about this topic, which is surprising if you think about the fact that when you look at the population structure, the Lusatian mining area is actually much more homogeneous than the other areas or the rest of Germany. So you might think, since the population isn't that diverse, at least in comparison, people shouldn't worry so much about cohesion. But I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. So in our interpretation, what these results show us is that the political communication is really relevant. We have to think about how we talk about structural transformation and how we talk about its consequences for social cohesion. And we also think that this means we should emphasize the relevance of political responsiveness when evaluating political funding programs, large funding programs. We also looked at timelines for these variables, for the worries or concerns about economy in general, and our own economic situation or the individual economic situation. And when looking at timelines, concerns about my own economic situation roughly mirror the development of life satisfaction. We have a gradual convergence, which slows down over the last few years. And again, the discrepancies between East and West is probably rooted in history. We have this convergence, which will probably go on, even though it started to slow down. The volatility of the answers here is somewhat higher than for the satisfaction, but aside from the recent years, convergence has been mostly steady. We see an increase in concern about my own economic situation, which can likely be attributed to external shocks over recent years, such as energy crises, and is not necessarily related to the coal phase out, or at least that's our interpretation of the results. We see a much higher volatility of concerns about economic development in general as compared to my own situation. And some of this volatility can relate to external shocks, but the extent to which this correlation is noticeable is surprising, or at least surprised us. This extent of volatility was not what we expected. And even more surprising is how noticeable the regional differences are, especially in recent years. Even though all mining areas are undergoing the same external shocks, close to 60% of people in Lusatia really are strongly concerned about the economy in general, compared to about half that in the Rhenish area, a region which is just as dependent on fossil energies and which has a much tighter timeline, shorter timeline for their coal phase out and for the complete change to renewable energies. Then we started to look at context factors. Give me a second. And started thinking about which factors could maybe, give me a second. Sorry about that. which factors could mainly maybe explain these huge differences that we see. And as mentioned in the beginning, these areas have a very different settlement structure. And from other research, we know that political attitudes often differ between more urban and more rural contexts. So what we looked at here are differences between large cities, medium-sized cities, and small towns and rural municipalities. Here we cannot show a timeline because the oversampling only started in 2022, but we can still look at differences over these last years and for the most for the newest data. But however, we cannot detect any noticeable correlation between settlement structure and concerns. So far, there's no clear result as to that, even when you look at other variables as well. And the slide only shows descriptives, but even so, we have not found any hints at the correlation here with other methods as well, other methods of analyses. In all regions, people living in rural areas and in large cities worry less about economic development, their own situation, and social cohesion than in medium-sized cities. So yeah, we really can't see a tendency, which actually surprised us. We then, as I mentioned in the very beginning, didn't look only at the level of the areas, the mining areas as a whole, but we looked at the county level. So we zoomed in on the areas, basically. The dots, each dot represents a county within one of the mining areas. The colors remain the same. So the yellow dots, they show the counties in the station mining area, the red dots, the central German mining area, and the green dots, the Rhenish mining area in West Germany. And in our analysis conducted so far, we selected 2 context factors as potential explanation, or at least as a contribution to explanations for regional discrepancies. Especially in the East German regions, we see, I mentioned that in the beginning, that they face a shrinking of population, whereas the Rhenish mining area mostly gains population through migration, which is why we chose the cumulative net migration as a context factor. And migration also means at least a potential change in population structure, which might affect the perception of social cohesion. So considering the results for cohesion and for concerns about social cohesion, net migration is a logical context factor, at least in our interpretation. But at least for life satisfaction in general, there seems to be no correlation between satisfaction and net migration at all. We have some hints at a correlation between net migration and satisfaction with household income, but we assume that there's no direct effect between these 2 factors, but there's a kind of mediating effect because net migration is a sign of economic growth and of positive development of the labor market, or at least it can be a positive sign for the development of a labor market, which should lead to a higher average household income. The second factor, the second context factor that we considered is GDP per capita. But here again, we did not really see any correlation, which is why I did not include this context factor in the diagrams or in the slides. So let's come to the concerns, which here again are more informative, just as in the timelines. The regions within the counties within the regions differ when it comes to the GDP per capita. There's a slight regional difference between East and West again. And for concerns here, we see some hints, at least, at slight correlations. And in counties with a higher GDP per capita, fewer people tend to express strong concerns about the economy in general, about their own economic situation, and about social cohesion in society. The correlations, though, and again, these are hints and not our final statistical analyses, we're still working on those, is stronger for concerns related to economic development, which seems intuitive. It's not really a surprise to us that the correlations seem to be stronger for concerns about the economy in general than for their own economic situations, because a GDP per capita or this indicator GDP per capita might not necessarily affect everyone in the same way. We do have close to no correlation between the GDP and concerns about social cohesion, which in this case wasn't really surprising for us. So let's turn for let's turn to the second context factor that we use, which is again the cumulative net migration over the years 1991 to 2022, which is again the newest data we can use. We do have correlations between concerns and the cumulative net migration, and these correlations show clearer tendencies. Because for economy-related concerns, we again assume that these hints at correlation show not necessarily a direct effect, but from the diagrams at least, we can see that in counties with positive net migration, people tend to worry less about the economy in general and their own economic situation, and again, we think this might be an indirect effect and show a generally positive development for the local labor market. For concerns about social cohesion, the negative correlation might actually seem counterintuitive at a first glance, because a higher net migration can lead, as I mentioned before, to a different population structure, a more diverse population structure, which seems to be which should not maybe be related to a lower share of people who are strongly concerned about social cohesion. But this just implies, at least in our interpretation, that social cohesion is not to be confused with the homogeneity within a population. And of course, it's important to keep in mind that these are only descriptive statistics, and that the number of cases here is 25. We have 25 counties within these 3 mining areas. So the results might be different if we had a larger number of cases, but we can't prove that, obviously. Therefore, we consider these results as hints and as starting points for further research, for more detailed research, which brings me to my conclusion. And at least for the presented cases, concerns are more informative than survey data on satisfaction when analyzing regional inequalities and developments. And that's something that we use as a starting point for our political work, or for our work in the evaluation of these political funding programs, that life satisfaction is a very interesting indicator, a very interesting concept to look at, but that it's actually more informative to look at what people are very concerned about, because here we see that the answers are more responsive to external shocks, which should be interesting for funding programs. The discrepancies between the regions and between individual concerns and the concern for collective development may be rooted in collective history and in regional identity. I mentioned regional identity before, because even after 35 years, the East German mining areas share a collective memory of the German reunification and the consequent economic, very radical change, which is perceived collectively as an upheaval. And another survey we recently conducted ourselves shows that structural change or transformation therefore entails many negative associations in these areas, which are not prevalent in the West German mining area. Even if oneself does not maybe face negative consequences, the associations are still negative. And as mentioned, we see these results as relevant for political communication and as a support for the strengthening of political responsiveness to local specifics. Some information on publication. I know that these sources here are all in German, but I just want to reiterate, we are really happy to provide any information in English as well. Please feel free to reach out, and we can work on translations or give you, as far as we can, access to the data and stay in contact about that. So that's the most recent publication, Life Satisfaction in German Lignite Mining Regions Between Individual Well-Being and Collective Concerns, which is basically most of what I presented to you today. And what we are working on next, or right now, is a compendium of maps called Quality of Life in Lignite Mining Region, and a companion volume, Methods and Operationalization, that's forthcoming. We hope to finish that in the next 3 to 4 months. It's going to be a collection about 50 maps covering a combination of those aforementioned indicators and other empirical data, such as official statistics, data of the German Meteorological Services, or climate change, and the adult education survey, plus a respective commentary, of course, and contextualization for this data. Just as an example here, we mapped the concerns about climate change and environmental protection, as well as concerns about economic development in regions currently heavily depending on the consumption of fossil fuels. And at least in the East German lignite mining areas, concerns about economic development are more pressing for people than worries about climate change or environmental protection, which can inform, in our interpretation, political communication about how to cope with the coal phase out and the region's future. So what we think is that it is important to engage as many people as possible, as actively as possible in structural transformation. And that should be easier when we focus on what is actually perceived as pressing, as urgent, as concerning. And again, we're happy to provide any info in English as well. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefanie. Marina, can you just confirm you're hearing me? I had an issue with the mic. Can you hear me, Stefanie? Okay, yeah, great.
Yep.
This was really a fascinating presentation, very, very interesting, very topical as well at the moment, of course, in the German context. That I know you've not talked about political factors and issues, but of course, everybody will be well aware with the rise of the AfD recent elections and the redrawing of the political map and landscape in Germany. So I guess one question is if you could reflect on the implications for politics. You did raise the issue of political communication. That was very clear in your conclusions. It wasn't as such covered, to my understanding, in your data set as such. I wonder if there are indicators on, for instance, media consumption and other related issues in terms of political communication that you could factor or have thought about factoring into your analyses. And the same with the identity question. I don't know whether that's covered in the panel and household data that you cover, whether there are such indicators on identity, given that it came out as such a key factor or potential implication. So just those kind of two sets of questions, and then we can open the debate for questions from the broader audience.
Let's start with your second question, indicators of media consumption for identity and so on. The problem is that we do have some indicators for these topics, but we can't do timelines with those because the oversampling only started in 2022. So whatever we do as analyses won't be representative. And that's why we haven't included it here. We do have such indicators as how much do you trust the media? How much do you trust political decision makers? How much do you trust parliament? There's a whole battery of items in the socioeconomic panel. And we see what we expected, that in East Germany, the skepticism is much higher than in West Germany, but we can't really break that down to the county level or for the mining areas because the oversampling the oversampling started later and we don't have enough cases to make that representative in a smaller spatial area. We do, of course, have indicators for voting behavior. And interestingly, we don't see a correlation. So people who usually vote, or at least the share of people who vote regularly and who have voted in the last election does not show any correlation to how I think about climate change or how satisfied I am, what my concerns are, which is something that surprised us, actually. We might have to look into that further. What we do see is that people who are generally more skeptical when it comes to how democracy works in general, they don't really think as often about climate change, but that's not really anything new and it's not really specific to the mining area, but it's something that we can see for all of Germany and for other countries as well. So implications of political communication, something that we have to keep in mind here, or at least that's something that's important for us, is that When it comes to AfD, for example, they are, of course, very prominent here in East Germany, and they have an increasing impact on political decision making, but that's mainly the state level or even on a smaller scale. So when it comes to the federal funding programs, they don't really have any connection to that because those funding programs were decided on in 2018 and 2019 when they were not really as prominent yet and didn't play an important role in or didn't really give an input into these policy programs. When it comes to satisfaction, of course, we have we expected a larger effect of political circumstances on satisfaction, but interestingly, we can't really see that. So the satisfaction, the level of life satisfaction is very, very close between the single states and between East and West Germany. We would have thought we would see a larger discrepancy there.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, really interesting, especially your earlier point on institutional trust, and in particular, if you like, the disaffection and distrust of institutions hypothesis seems to be more important than other factors, socioeconomic status, traditional cognitive kind of resources in the political science literature. We can open up now for other comments, questions, and answers. You can either put comments in the box or just raise your hand and introduce yourself briefly, please. Or skip the raising your hand and
Hi,
Ruth.
Carlos. Hi. Hi, Stephanie. Thank you very much. That was a really fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm interested, and maybe you can correct me if I've didn't understand this properly, but I was interested in the fact that there seemed to be, in general, positive correlation between net migration and life satisfaction and economic security, whereas at the wider debate that there were more concerns about the collective side. I think that's really interesting. And I wondered if you had any more insight into that, because again, from my understanding from the German press, a lot of the far right focus in the last election was I mean, the AfD are very anti-climate, but a lot of the focus was on the negative impact of migration. And so those two things, it's interesting that the political dialogue from the far right, especially, you know, if it's strong showing in Eastern Germany, was very anti-migration, and yet what you seem to be finding is that there is actually quite a positive, potentially a positive correlation between net migration and an understanding of sort of economic security. So I guess there's not much of a question in there, but I think I just found that a really interesting point, and I wondered whether you had any more insight into that, because those two things seem to stand against each other and are very important in the political dialogue.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for your comment. And we thought the exact same thing, which is why we think that net migration might not be the direct effect, or doesn't have a direct effect on life satisfaction, and about my concerns about the economic development or my own economic situation. But we think since the mining areas are mostly shrinking regions, they do profit, the economy does profit from migration, whether people like it or not, because we need migration to have professionals to work jobs that are created here, or we have to try to get people in to actually keep businesses running, etc., etc. So whether the individuals like it or not, we do see positive economic effects of migration, net migration. And maybe there's a kind of a disjunct discussion here. So in political debate, we only hear about the negative effects and criminal development of crime, etc., etc. But that doesn't really have an impact, or doesn't necessarily have an impact on how the economy really develops. So maybe people think about these negative migration effects, but what they feel here is positive, well, ideally positive economic development, and they don't really make this connection when they answer question about their concerns and about how satisfied they are. And then there's also the problem or the challenge of how net migration is operationalized, because it doesn't only contain people like migration over national borders. So it's not only about migrants in the way that the AFD talks about migration, but it also encompasses people who travel or who migrate within these or across the regions within Germany. And that's also something people don't usually think about when they are asked about migration or prompted about migration. So the political debate about migration is toxic in places, absolutely, but they focus on a very specific aspect of migration, which is not mirrored in the exact same way in this indicator that we use. So that might be two reasons to explain these results that are really, and I totally agree, counterintuitive when we look at them at first glance.
Thank you very much. And it is a very interesting and I think quite topical point that you found, because there's been recent coverage in the press of the Spanish Labour minister sort of saying about the potentially positive, well, not potentially, the positive effects of migration into Spain and the Spanish labour market. And yet in many other countries, including the UK, there is often a toxic conversation about it. Which, again, going back to your point about how to change and influence that political messaging is probably very relevant. So thank you.
Yeah, there's actually another project here that was just concluded. Again, the first publication, at least, is only in German, unfortunately, but we're working on translations. And that was an interview study here in Seisha about welcoming culture or welcoming people who come here for certain positions, whether they be migrants or not, but most of them are, because the study focused on the care sector. And so there are many people here who travel into the region, who come here as migrants, who work in this kind of sector. And what we see is that there are huge initiatives. There's a huge effort to create this kind of welcoming culture. There are opportunities to talk to people who've moved here before. There are there's support with everything you need to organize, any official documents, et cetera, and businesses here actually put huge effort into somehow building support structures and somehow seem to be attractive for everyone who wants to move here, because it's so absolutely necessary to have migration in these regions to basically stay alive. You know, we have a majorly shrinking population, so that's really a problem. But we do again see a discrepancy between these actors who know that there is a positive economic effect of migration and what people who don't really make this mental connection feel about migration. And that's still an open question, and maybe one of the biggest challenges that we have to combat here, how to somehow cross this gap, how to somehow span this gap and build bridges there.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more observations or questions?
I can ask a question.
Thank
That's
you.
okay.
Odilia.
So, hi, I'm Odilia. I'm a national expert from the Netherlands. And the indicators that you mentioned really remind me of the ongoing monitoring here, which is called brede welvaart or broad welfare. They also include indicators such as satisfaction, life satisfaction. And I was wondering, do you only look at the German context, or are you also looking at other EU countries who are monitoring the same kind of indicators?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for your question. And I already noted down the broad welfare to look into that further. So right now, we unfortunately are restricted to the German context, which is partly grounded in this political task that we have here, and is partly related to what we are supposed to be doing here. I know that's not really a valid point from a scientific point of view, but that's one of the reasons. And another reason is that we can get this georeferenced small-scale data only for these areas, and we of course know that there are other data sets that are similar in their structure in other countries, but for now we still look for a way to connect these data sets and come to comparisons that are actually valid and methodologically sound. So that's definitely a plan we have for the future, but we haven't really started that yet.
Thank you, Stefanie. Just picking up on that point. So you obviously have this micro level geolocated data, household panels and individuals, but you said that this is part of a wider study and evaluation of federal funding programs, huge funding programs with billions of investments. Are you able to link in with the broader evaluations and measure interventions, the scale of funding at the same geolocated level, perhaps slightly higher, but do you have access to intervention level data on spending flows, for instance, across different districts or sub-districts, and able to link the two?
We have access to this kind of data. It's not really easy to link them, mainly because they are different data sources, and because, to be honest, not all these evaluations have a very good coordination, because the evaluation is not something that's organized at the federal level, but the states do that separately. And we are working with them on these reports, so we do have access to the data. What is not that easy for us right now is the linking, because they don't use these subjective indicators, but focus solely on things like economic development, labor market development. And the evaluation is difficult to link because the funding program doesn't affect the regions as a whole in an equal way, but it's very focused on specific single projects, individual projects. What's another plan here is to do a synthetic control comparison, a project we want to start as soon as we can, but that's always dependent on the capacities that we have and the personnel that we have here. And in this synthetic control study, we would like to build synthetic control cases to counties and their specific projects, and then we would be able to extrapolate the effect of a funding for a specific project. So it's definitely on our minds, and it would be a great project. We just kind of haven't gotten around to it yet.
And are these purely national or also EU cohesion policy funded programs and projects that you're referring to?
They are purely national funded programs, and the law that put this funding program into place actually forbids the financing of a project at the same time from other funds, so they can't be combined with EU cohesion policy.
Okay. Do we have any more questions?
Can I come in, Carlos? Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for the interesting presentation, Stefanie. So I'm also part of the EPRC team. We've been, some of us have been working on a project that was about, well, it's still ongoing, about citizen participation and factors that well, either preclude or actually incentivize participation of citizens in coal mining regions. And one of the factors that we were looking at was the perceived relevance of transitions to one's life or one's community, and how that affects motivation to engage in any discussions about transitions and transition policies, notably. So I was just thinking of that when you mentioned towards the end of your presentation the importance of actually identifying these concerns of communities or citizens, and that this information is valuable in order to actually engage with citizens, that this would facilitate their participation. I was wondering if I understood that correctly and if you have gone any deeper into that issue.
Please correct me if I didn't get your comment right or the question. With these results, we would argue for the relevance of more participation and for more responsiveness. The problem is here that these funding programs don't necessarily include this or plan for this participation, but there is a shift toward more participation, especially in the Rhenish mining region. They have actually started a program for citizen participation that's very restricted to certain topics, and mostly that's restricted to what to do with the landscape. So you have these huge regions where coal mining actually shaped the landscapes in itself. And now there's the question: what do we do with these landscapes, and what is left of the actual process of lignite mining? And in most areas, those holes are converted to lakes and to tourist areas. And there's a lot of criticism against that, actually, but it's still one of the few plans that are that are working right now, and that the states are working on. And at least in their case, they usually offer they call it citizen walks and participation and dialogue, and try to include everyone who is directly affected in that area, and at least get some input and get a feel for the mood around. That does not mean that they really include any suggestions that come from public participation, which in turn sometimes lead to a huge level of frustration, because then you're asked to give input, but then you don't really know what happens with that, or decisions are totally different in the end. But at least there are some processes to engage the public, even though it's restricted to single projects and to the people who are living there directly. But then again, those are also the people who are directly affected, so it's most important to include them.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I was more generally wondering, I guess, if there was any correlation between identifying these worries and concerns and kind of linking that to how to motivate people to come in and participate. Because if they see the stakes, based on what you found in terms of their worries, maybe they would be more responsive.
Yeah, we hope that there is a connection, and that when we try to be more responsive in our communication to what people concerns in those areas, that there might be more engagement. But the problem is that we also see a correlation between active participation and these items that I mentioned before about how much I trust Parliament, how much I trust the state in general, how much I trust democracy. There's a big correlation there, and I think those might be factors that kind of cancel each other out, or that are definitely not easily overcome. So we'll have to see where that takes us.
Yeah, that was my thinking as well. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's a classic point in the literature. Engaging the disengaged is extremely difficult to do. Are there any other questions, observations? No? Okay, well, let me just thank you, Stefanie. It was a really fascinating presentation. Stefan, you just popped up in the last minute. Do you have a question? No. Okay. Really fascinating presentation. A lot of wealth of data, many interesting insights, and also future studies. We look forward to seeing them. Thanks again for your participation, sharing your slides, which will circulate, and also the video. Just to say to everybody else, we have another webinar coming up on the 16th of April with Giancarlo Cotella from Politecnico di Torino, who will present on the role of metropolitan areas within EU cohesion policy. So please do contact us to register but I think everybody on the mailing list will receive that invitation. And also we hope to see you at future events. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye, everybody.